Hello once again. Today is Monday, July 29th. My name is Matt Fury, and this is The Rough Cut. Greetings, friends and fellow post-production geeks. Thanks for dropping in on us today. Always happy to have you here, and most certainly always happy to introduce you to some amazing people working in the film and TV industry today. One of those amazing people is Fred Raskin, and it just so happens he's on the show today, and with good reason. More so than that he's just a nice guy and a talented editor, although that certainly is reason enough to have him on the show. But actually, Fred has a pretty big, highly anticipated movie out in theaters now. Perhaps you've heard of it, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a new film and the 9th film from director Quentin Tarantino. And ever since this movie screened at the Cannes Film Festival earlier this year, the buzz on the project has been relentless. And we, that's you and me, are really fortunate to get to talk with Fred about this film and his approach to crafting it in the editing room. Speaking for myself, and who else can you really speak for when it comes right down to it, I would really like to know what's different between what was on the page and what he discovered in the editing room. I think there's a lot to talk about there. He's been with Quentin for 3 films now, Django Unchained, Hateful Eight, and now finally, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Why wait any longer? Let's ask him all about it. Here's Fred Raskin.
This is one of the handful of studio movies this summer that are not franchise movies. And people who aren't a big fan of those things, like, this is the biggest movie that they have to look forward to. So
I know you're no stranger to the big franchise movies either, so we'll talk about that as well. But when I first reached out to you, I think a few weeks back, you had mentioned that you were still working on the film. And here it is, it just opened. How late were you working on the film? Up to what point? And what kind of things were you doing at the last mile?
The cut of the movie was done about a month ago. Like, we finished the mix. The movie itself has been done for about a month. But my first assembly of the movie was, I want to say, 4 hours and 41 minutes long. Which is a solid 2 hours longer than the final running time of the movie. So there is a lot of additional material, and it's not clear if any of that material is going to see the light of day. But in the same way as we did an extended version of The Hateful Eight, we thought that it would be prudent to at least prepare for something like that potentially happening in the future. So what I was doing was going through all of the old cuts and finding all of the deleted scenes and various different versions of the deleted scenes and what combinations of them they could occur in, and kind of digging them all up and logging them so that if we do indeed end up doing like a longer, say, miniseries type version, I know where all the bodies are buried.
Well, that's a good thing to know. So a month ago for the last assembly, you said, the
final mix.
Final mix. Okay, so this film, you had a screening at Cannes, which was very well received. What kind of shape was it in then? How did the film change between that time and now the wide release?
Honestly, it's really very minor stuff. There's only 3 changes that I can really think of. The movie's about 2 minutes longer than it was at Cannes. The scene, let's see, Sharon picking up the hitchhiker on her way to Westwood Village. That's a new little bit. When Jim Stacy meets Rick Dalton on the set of Lancer, then goes into the Great Escape. Not exactly flashback, but fantasy, I guess. That scene was not in at Cannes. And then the mid-credits little Easter egg.
Okay, good. We won't spoil that.
But, it's probably good to talk about that so people know not to leave their seats.
Yes, no, I think audiences have gotten so used to that. And again, thanks to a lot of the big franchises that you've worked on as well, that you're conditioned, and this is a good thing, to sit through those credits and get familiar with some of these names that are associated with these films. And then you get a nice little bonus bit there.
Exactly. Having said that, it's probably not the nicest thing to an audience who's just been sitting for the last 2 hours and 38 minutes.
It's a bit of a marathon, but it's a great ride all the way. How did that improve the story? The bit with Sharon picking up the hitchhiker, what did it tell us more about her character? What did you hope to achieve with that?
I think it was really a case of, it gives us a little more, like one more aspect of Sharon's sweetness, that she's the type of person who would do this. And you get some of that you get a lot of that in all of her scenes. The moment that really comes to mind is when the box office girl says, can you stand over by the poster so people know who you are? And she's just like, okay, like she's not offended. And so showing her picking up the hitchhiker, I think, is another element of that. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting from the perspective of when the movie takes place and the actual events is on the night of August 8th, 1969. That's the date when people stopped picking up hitchhikers. And so I think that scene kind of speaks towards something that was lost after the events of that night.
The end of a certain aspect of innocence for that culture. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Before we get further into Once Upon a Time, I'd like to hear about your first interactions with Quentin. You're working as his editor. This is your third film as his editor, dating back to Django Unchained, I believe.
Yeah.
What sort of feeling out process did you and he go through as director and editor? Did you feel comfortable with him straight away, where you felt you could freely express your opinions on the story? And did you feel that he had complete trust in you, or are those things that you just have to evolve over time?
Well, I was an assistant editor on the Kill Bill movies, and my creative work on those movies was primarily involved in sound effects editing for his brilliant previous editor, Sally Menke. And so we spent a lot of time together on that movie talking about movies. Like, I think he had a very good sense as to what a fan of the medium I was. And so I think that had a lot to do with his decision to hire me for Django. He always kept me kind of in the family, like when they finished their rough cuts of both Death Proof and Inglourious Bastards. He invited me to screenings. Like, I was one of a very small handful of people who he brought in, and that was a tremendous honor. So when we started doing Django, there was definitely some trepidation on my part. Like, when you have disagreements, how much are you going to stand your ground? Certainly, the relationship has evolved over time. I've gained more confidence in my willingness to just kind of say whatever's on my mind, and to understand that he's not going to blow a gasket. Like, that he understands that we're kind of both coming from the place of wanting to do what's best for the movie. And I think he's gained a little bit more confidence in my abilities just by us having worked together for so long now. I think before, we hadn't worked together, and he knew my work that he'd seen, like in the Fast and Furious movies, but it wasn't the same as actually looking at his footage and seeing what I can do with it. And I think from the get-go, it was pretty apparent to him that I understood what he was going for. We were very much in sync, but obviously, the more time we spend together and the more he sees me doing my thing with his stuff, the more excited he is to see my initial pass on anything.
So getting back to current time, he comes to you with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. What were your initial thoughts when he brought it to you? Did the script present any obvious challenges or concerns to you about how it might come together in the editing room? And what was the process of him sharing it with you?
He invited me to his home to read the screenplay. But before I read the screenplay, he gave me like an introductory speech that would introduce me to the world in which the movie took place. He had the TV guide from the night of the murders. From the week of the murders, I should say, which, interestingly enough, you see it in the movie. Wojtek is sitting on the couch reading it. And on the cover is Andrew Duggan, who was the lead, or the co-lead, I should say, of the show Lancer. So,
perfect.
He talked about a lot of the actors of the era, people like Ty Hardin, actors who were TV stars and were trying to make the TV to movies transition and were not always successful. He talked about the ones who were successful, Burt Reynolds and Clint Eastwood, and kind of putting Rick Dalton, like giving him a place in history. And he talked a lot about Lancer, actually, because the Lancer scenes that are in the movie are adapted from the pilot episode of the TV show Lancer. So, yeah, he introduced me to the world, and then he put me in his guest house and said, okay, here's the screenplay, enjoy. And I told him, I'm the slowest reader on the face of the planet, so you got to give me a lot of time. He's like, it's totally fine. I was like, I'm probably going to need about 6 hours. And now, as it turns out, I did it in 5.
Oh, nice.
This is nothing really to be particularly proud of. But I would say once an hour, Quentin popped his head in to ask me what I was thinking and feeling, which, of course, only increases the pressure.
Oh, yeah. And so he introduces you to that world, and you dig through it in 5 hours. As you're reading it, are you making notes and thinking, okay, this could be tricky, or I'm going to have to keep this in mind, or I'm going to make a special consideration about this element of it, something just to prepare yourself for editorial?
Not so much. I mean, I wanted the experience of an audience member. Like, I just kind of wanted to read it as though I was just sitting in the theater watching it, and not so much focusing on what it's going to mean for me as the editor. This was also, the movie was a long ways out. I mean, this was at least a year before production started. So it was really more just familiarizing myself with the story and the characters. I think it's interesting. The screenplay was massive. I can't actually tell you how many pages it was because it was broken up into the main body of the movie and then the third act, or what at the time was referred to as the epilogue. And they had separate page counts. And so I don't actually remember what the total page count was, but it was probably over 180 pages. And so there was the thought of, okay, what in this massive opus is not going to make it in? One of the big concepts that ultimately did not make the movie is that the Lancer storyline, the way it was originally designed, there were 4 scenes from Lancer. In the finished movie, there are only 2, the middle 2. But in his original screenplay, you could actually follow the story of the Lancer episode. And what's funny is I don't remember saying this. He tells me this was my response after reading it, and it kind of sounds like me, so I'm going to go with it, which was that when I was in the Lancer scenes, I kind of wanted to just get back to Rick, Cliff, and Sharon, that I wasn't as invested in that storyline. And as we kind of found the movie and were cutting it down, one of the big things that had to go was that idea of following the Lancer storyline. So apparently my initial reaction that I don't even really remember was spot on. So hey,
it
good
paid
on me.
off. Was there anything about that intact storyline that was meant to reflect or somehow support the broader story structure of the film?
No, actually, I think it was really designed as just another layer of the entertainment value that the movie provides. I think one of the things that I really love about the movie is it is deceptively nonviolent, or at least for the first 2 hours or so. Like when you think back on it, you think, oh, it's a really nice movie. But I say deceptively because we're regularly cutting to scenes from Rick's TV shows and movies, which are incredibly violent. Like he's shooting 4 guys off their horses. He's taking a flamethrower to a room full of Nazis. And so it kind of allows us to give the audience that thrill without making them feel like they're experiencing something uncomfortable they don't want to be experiencing.
Well, it's funny. I'm going to have to change my notes because I have like little opens and closes I do to this podcast, and I put in things like deceptively complex and what's the other one? Comfortably uneasy, which I think is a hallmark of this film. But I'll worry about that later, or maybe I'll just leave it in. Just one final note on the Lancer bit, and just maybe I read this wrong, but I was really curious to ask you. So the scenes that are still in there, Rick Dalton, to me, is a really good actor. Like, he does a good scene. He's good. And I think it's important to point out, it's like, just because his career is on the downslope or he's at the tail end, doesn't mean he wasn't a quality actor and can't do great work.
That's absolutely true. And that is genuinely a testament to Leonardo DiCaprio's performance. I feel like we're frequently presented with TV shows or movies where there's a character who is spoken about as being like, she's a brilliant comedian, but you never actually see her doing her comedy routine because it might not meet your expectations. Here, Quentin and Leo both really went for it. You see him performing, and when you first see him in the Lancer episode, when he's eating the chicken bone, he's hamming it up.
Right.
But we've met the director, Sam Wanamaker. He's kind of hammy. He's playing things big. So Rick is performing the scene the way he's been directed to perform it. But no, he's a very capable actor, and he's got his own insecurities and his own issues, and he gets inside his head too much, as we see when he freaks out after blowing his lines. But deep down, he's actually very good at his job. And I think it's one of the things that draws us to him and makes us root for him is his level of competency is very high.
Yeah, and it's a great point you made about Wanamaker sort of directing him to be hammy, because when he does deliver that big, I think it's the evil Hamlet, if I remember right, Wanamaker tells him, it's like, hey, that was a great choice you made. You were the one that made that happen. It didn't come from me. So that's excellent point on your part. One more note about prepping you for the film. A lot of times directors will say, hey, I want you to watch these movies. For this time out, Quentin actually went out and did... he said, these are the 10 movies. He's running them at his New Beverly Cinema. I think I caught some of them were on, it might have been AMC or I forget the network. But did you do that as well? Did you sit down and watch those movies just to get in that headspace?
I watched as many of them as I was able to. He did screenings for the crew regularly during pre-production. And actually, there were a few that happened during production also. Like, we screened Valley of the Dolls so that we could see, you know, what is kind of considered, certainly Roman Polanski considered it the best performance that Sharon ever gave. And she's really good in that movie. And then there's a movie called Model Shop that was that took place in 1969 Hollywood. And you could literally, like, that was actually more to see what the town looked like back then. It's actually not so different. There are a lot of things that are remarkably unchanged. The screenings were valuable both for setting up the time period and for seeing some of these characters in real life. We watched, of course, The Great Escape. He would do them as crew screenings. I think the only other thing that he had us watch was the pilot for Lancer. And he didn't direct the Lancer stuff in the movie the way the pilot for Lancer is directed because, I mean, for a couple reasons. Number one, he considered the Lancer stuff in this movie to be his third Western. So he wanted to treat it like a Quentin Tarantino Western, as opposed to an era-appropriate TV Western. Part of the concept of Lancer originally is that when it comes in, we open on this Western world. As I said, the first Lancer scene is not actually in the movie anymore. But when it was introduced, we come in on this Western world, and we don't know where we are. We don't know what's going on. We spend a few minutes there, and it's only when Sam Wanamaker comes in on a crane and yells "cut," and then Rick and Cliff arrive on set that we understand what we've been watching. And obviously, if the format had changed, you know, if it went from the 240 CinemaScope look to a 4:3 look, you would have instantly been clued in that was that we were watching a TV show. So he had to kind of direct it like it was a big movie.
So the movie is obviously rich with things like you're watching old TV shows that he did or scenes that he did, and they're presented in the 4:3, and with, you know, you can tell you're watching a quote unquote finished piece. There's a bit he does where he's on the show Hullabaloo singing. And that seemed to be done like the audience was actually on set with him. You were there in the moment with him as opposed to watching the finished piece on television. Am I recollecting that properly? And if I am, what was the decision making behind doing that somewhat differently?
So, sort of. It is actually shot and cut like it would have been done with the TV cameras, but it was also shot in the 2:40 aspect ratio.
Right.
So the cutting style and the angles that were chosen were intended to emulate the TV cutting style of that show. But it was shot in the same aspect ratio as the movie, mainly because, as originally conceived, that was going to be part of a main title sequence. So he shot it more like the movie, but I'm going to give him all the credit when he decided to put it into the Musso and Frank sequence as something that Marvin watched to learn a little bit more about Rick. Then it just kind of had to play like that. And I mean, he says, like, I watched a kinescope. Well, this is obviously not a kinescope. This looks a lot better than that.
Right.
But, you know, the audience can just kind of go with it.
Well, I think that's what you do is you just kind of go with it. So this is a big Hollywood movie about Hollywood, so it's not surprising that the leads are movie stars. Had the good fortune to talk to editor Robert Layton once.
Oh, yeah. Interestingly enough, Bob is the first big editor who I met when I moved out to L.A., and my meeting with him was at Musso and Frank.
Oh, that's weird. Okay.
I actually visited the set during the week that they were shooting at Musso and Frank, and I had this kind of flashback to me at age 21 or 22 sitting down at a table in that restaurant for the first time with like someone who working in Hollywood. And then here I am now 20 some years later looking at arguably the two best actors of their generation doing a scene together. And like, I got a little misty eyed. It was a very moving kind of moment.
Well, I could see why. Okay. So we're both charter members of the Bob Layton fan club.
Indeed.
So when I was talking to him, for those that aren't familiar with his IMDb, it's ridiculous. But he edited, among all the things he did, A Few Good Men, starring Tom Cruise. And he was talking to me about how when he was working on a film with a movie star like Tom Cruise, he had the tendency to get a little distracted by the charisma of the movie star, and it somewhat influences your editing. Like, he found that he might have been staying on tight shots too much. And I was like really fascinated by the comments, and I certainly hope I'm not butchering it or remembering it incorrectly, as I'm apt to do. But I wondered if, you know, you got Leo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt there, and you got to let them have their moment. So does that change the way you cut a little bit?
You know, actually, I don't think so. They're so good that it gave us the freedom to put the movie together however we wanted. There was never any situation where we had to cut around them. Quentin had some very specific ideas for the way the movie was going to be put together, and the actors were as an integral a part of making that happen as everything else. So we were able to put it together exactly the way Quentin wanted, because there was never any concerns with the performances where we had to work around something. And I think there are certain things that happened on set. Like I'll give you an example. The end of the Lancer sequence, the little bit in the trailer when Trudy comes up to him and says, "That's the best acting I've ever seen in my whole life." Like the way that plays out in the close-up on Leo, that happened on set. Quentin decided, listen, I want to play this all in a close-up on you. That was something that he knew he could do because Leo was that good. Yeah. A lesser actor, maybe we wouldn't have been able to play it that way. Maybe we would have had to cut around it. But I mean, Leo is magnificent in that. Like, I remember watching that take in dailies, and the entire crew burst into applause when the scene ended, because you just see like the tears welling up in his eyes. He's so proud of himself, and I think the audience is just as proud of him at that moment.
Right around that same time, and in the same characters, you stay on a really long two-shot of he and the little girl just getting to know each other.
Yep.
And I'm thinking, like, Quentin Tarantino is pretty specific about people sticking to his script and to his words, so I can't imagine there's a ton of improv, but that's a long interaction there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Quentin actually probably used more improv in this movie than certainly in either of the two other ones that I've done with him, but none of that is improv. Wow. That whole scene is scripted, and he's pretty clear about having the actors stick to the script. When he used improv, like the scene when Rick freaks out in his trailer and he's smashing things and he's just mad at himself, Quentin gave Leo, these are the main beats that we have to hit. I'm not going to write the scene for you. I kind of want you to just kind of make sure you hit these beats, but let's improv it. It was all shot from one angle. I think he did 4 takes of it. And what you see in the movie is, obviously there's lots of jump cuts because we only had one angle, but that kind of works toward getting inside the character's head, like how flustered he is. I think that kind of plays toward that. But that was all Leo just kind of riffing on the things that Quentin had given him to talk about.
One more quick follow-up on the movie star aspect.
Sure.
So we talked about the adherence to the script and all that, but a lot of times on big movies with big stars, they will come into the editing room and sit down and review cuts, and they'll have notes of their own. Did that happen at all in this film, or is that something you're familiar with on other films?
Well, Quentin, his MO really is, I'm not showing the movie to anyone until it's done. So no, that was not, that's not anything that, and I'm trying to think of if I've experienced that on other movies. I mean, I guess on the Fast and Furious movies, the actors would come in and watch scenes, but I don't know that there were ever like changes made based on anything that they saw. I mean, I think that's a little dangerous. Like we want to do what's best for the movie, not what's best for the actor.
Absolutely.
Not that the actors are not a key component of the filmmaking process, but I think sometimes you become a little, you remember the scene that you did, that you loved, that you thought was great, and in the grand scheme of the movie, it's just not necessary, or maybe it even hurts us. And Quentin, obviously, he's lived with this project for a long time. Like he wrote it, he directed it, he's in the editing room every day once we get into post. If he's cutting something out, it's something that he worked really hard on. So it's as painful for him as it is for any of the actors or anyone who worked on it. So he's not taking those decisions lightly. But ultimately, it does have to be specifically what he wants it to be for the movie as a whole.
Well, that's a terrific point, and one you can never really overlook when you're talking about Quentin Tarantino, where he is the writer and the director. And when you're working with a director that's also a writer, does it make the editorial process any more difficult because you are making changes to something they've worked on so intently leading up to production?
So in this movie, not so much, mainly because it was so long. Like, I told him how long my assembly was, and we kind of had an idea that the movie was going to be around 2 hours and 45 minutes, and somehow we were going to have to get it to that length. And so then it really became about how are we going to do this? And arguably, the 2 best pieces of writing in the screenplay are not in the movie, because we made a hugely significant cut. Like, probably the biggest chunk of the movie that came out was the 4th Lancer scene. The way that storyline is resolved was a big scene that you couldn't imagine the movie without when you read the screenplay. And it was Quentin actually who, like, we screened the whole movie, and he was like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think we're going to drop that scene. Because it came kind of at the very end of, it was actually the last scene in the Sunday day of the movie, the second day in which the movie takes place. So it was the last thing before the third act begins. And he was like, the story's over by then. Basically, once we leave Spawn Ranch, we kind of want to wrap it up. And once Rick and Cliff have watched the FBI together, this is the end of their day. These are these two friends, like Cliff watching his friend do what he does so well, and the two of them just enjoying each other's company. And it's like, you know what? We're ready to move on. And so, I mean, it was his suggestion, like, we should try cutting out this huge scene, and we did. And we knew at the moment he said it, it was like, that's what we have to do. So I think because of how long this movie was, it became easier for him to let go of his babies, to kill his darlings. I mean, there was one scene that was in the movie, like right up until we were about to leave for Cannes, and Quentin was like, you know what? I love this scene, but I think it's got to go. And it was something that it had been in and out of the movie. It kept leaving and then coming back. And ultimately, like at the last minute, he said, I want the movie to move at a faster clip, and this is not necessary. So he's pretty good about understanding that. If he feels like something is really necessary, then no, he's not going to lose it. Certainly anything that's going to contribute to the character is not something that he's going to want to lose. But if it's not helping us, it's got to go.
So we had some fun with the word deception earlier, and I finally got to my question where that word pops up. And that the movie seems to be deceptively complex for what is ultimately a fairy tale movie. And it sort of reminds you of the idiom of whom much is given, much is requested, or much is expected. That's certainly true with the actors. They get this great script and great characters. But also you as an editor, it seems like you have so much to work with in terms of being free to play with story structure or use vehicles like voiceovers, titles, flashbacks, jump cuts, intersecting storylines. I mean, there's just so much in your bag of tricks when you're working on a film with him. But I wonder, are those things that are hard-coded into the script, or a lot of those things that you discovered during editorial?
It's about 50-50. And they're almost all things that popped out of his imagination or his creative concepts, whether they're in the script or not. The idea of the flashback within the flashback, like when we go to the Bruce Lee scene from Cliff on the roof,
great scene.
And then we get Cliff on the boat with his wife. This was all in the script. That's not anything that I can take credit for. Even the way when the narrator comes in and like it freeze frames and goes to a flashback, like this is all kind of built into the script. And we tweak the way we're going to do it as we're putting it together. But most of that was scripted. Every once in a while, we'll find something in editing.
Even things like the Playboy cover overlay or the titles that you'll drop in.
That, again, that was all Quentin. And it was he had the idea to do it. And he was like, I can't believe no one's ever done this before. And we put it on there, and we were all kind of like, how is that possible?
It works.
It works great. And even like the Steve McQueen, Michelle Phillips, Jay Sebring, the little titles that pop up there, that was not in the script. And actually, neither was the Playboy Mansion thing, for that matter. That was all something that came about in editing. But we realized there's nothing telling you who these characters are. It wasn't designed to have narration introducing you to them. And Quentin said, you know what? Let's just put it on the screen. Let's get it out of the way. Like, we'll tell them, they'll understand it, and we don't need to dwell on it.
Shortest distance between 2 points.
Yeah, and that's something that I feel like most filmmakers or even like studio executives say, you can't do that. But for Quentin, it's like, you know what? We're going to do it once. We're going to get it out of the way, and everybody knows what they're looking at. And that's one of my favorite little bits of titles in the movie.
Well, the narration also that you brought up is it's really different. And again, another one of those, like, I can't believe no one's ever done it this way before. So very early on in the movie, you hear a brief bit of narration from Kurt Russell's character, Randy, who you haven't met. You haven't met him yet.
No. I want to clarify something. It's Kurt Russell. It's not Randy. Kurt is, he's playing Randy in the movie, obviously, but the narrator is not Randy. He's essentially playing two roles in the movie. Though it's interesting that you thought that, I'm kind of curious how that impacted your enjoyment of the movie. Like, it's interesting, actually. There was a lot of discussion as to who was going to be the narrator, because that was always scripted. And it was when Ricky Jay passed away that we were talking about the movie Magnolia and how he is the narrator of that opening section of the movie. And he also plays a role in the movie. And it's pretty clear that it's not the same character. And that kind of allowed us to say, oh, well, there's kind of no one more perfect for this than Kurt Russell, by virtue of the fact that he is an actor who got his start in the TV westerns of the early 60s and made the TV to movies transition successfully. And he's in Quentin's stable of actors.
The Tarantino Theater Company, yeah.
Exactly. So he was just kind of the perfect choice all around. But no, conceptually, that's not supposed to be Randy doing the narration.
Okay, so just to further flesh out the point. So you hear a bit of narration, voiceover.
Yes.
You don't know who it is. It's just Kurt Russell. And then there's no more voiceover. And then you meet Randy. I mean, for me, I drew the conclusion, it's Kurt, so there's Kurt.
Sure.
But then no more voiceover until the final act of the film, where it's brought in to great effect. And most conventional structures, you'd be hearing from Kurt every now and then. But this is just a little bit up front, and then absolutely nothing till the end, when he's there throughout. And again, that was one of the things, like, wow, I wonder if that's something they just sort of discovered, or it was always planned that way.
It was sort of planned that way. I want to say there were maybe 2 or 3 other lines of narration in the first 2 hours or so of the movie that just ended up getting cut out. And so really only one of them remained. And it was a comment that a lot of people had, like, shouldn't you have a little bit more narration? Shouldn't you introduce the narrator at the very beginning? And Quentin's feeling was kind of like, the audience is going to get it. Maybe they're going to be bothered by it, and if they are, oh well, nothing I can do about that. But there's nothing they're not going to understand by the way we're doing it. So even if this is not traditional, I don't care.
Well, and that's the best part about this and the way he does things, is that, so this is sort of a ticking time bomb throughout this movie, and that you're aware that something really bad is going to happen at the end. And the titles and the inclusion of, like, the dates and the times, the pace changes, the mood changes, something dark is about to happen. And that's, for me, the way the voiceover, that it lent to that. It's like, oh boy, here we go. You're sort of stealing yourself in your seat, like, knowing how Quentin operates and what happened in real life. You're like, okay, I'm going to just prepare myself for something that is going to be visceral.
Yeah, no, it's specifically the moment when the narrator introduces you to Wojtek and Abigail. That's kind of the moment when, we're actually dealing with this now. This is coming.
You referenced that as being the final act. And to me, as much as you and Quentin chapterize and sort of organize the story within the story, it never feels to me like it follows a true 3-act structure. It feels like anything could turn on a dime at any moment.
No, it definitely does not follow anything resembling a traditional structure. I mean, truly, the movie is virtually plotless for its first 2 hours. It's really only when you get into what we called during production the epilogue, and by what we're now calling the third act, that the plot kind of kicks in. And there are threads of like, is Rick going to be able to deliver the scene effectively? Like, that kind of becomes a storyline. Actually, a lot of that was kind of found in the process of making the movie. Like, the freak out in the trailer was not in the screenplay. That was something that Quentin came up with, I think, with Leo as they were working on the character. You know that the Manson murders are in the distance, the 2 days in February, where the main body of the movie takes place. And that certainly hangs over the whole Spawn Ranch sequence. But no, it's not really until you get to the third act that the story really kicks in.
So I love talking about stories so much that I always do it at the sacrifice of talking about the tools. And here it is: I work for Avid and never bring up the word Avid during the interview. So I should probably, if I want to keep my job, ask you a little bit about the editorial setup, your team, and how you all work together.
So, the movie was shot on film. The negative was scanned in at 4K. And then those scans were down-converted to HD. We edited at DNX 115 on the Avid. And then I had a team of assistants. My first assistant, Chris Tonic, he's the Avid assistant. He would take the cut and would spit out lists to the film crew who would conform the work picture to match the Avid edit so that we could screen the movie on film. So kind of as we completed a scene, they would get turned over to the film crew, and so that ultimately we were able to watch the entire movie on film.
Sounds so easy.
Well, it took an army. I mean, this is like 6 or 7 people who were working on this.
I got like 50 more questions for you, but we'll just have to do a part 2 of this someday, maybe when it comes out on DVD or something.
By all means.
In the meantime, I do have one final question. It's a quick one if you can squeak it in. I know you have a screening coming up with Ace. When you're screening a film for your fellow editors, how does that make you feel? Are you a little more nervous knowing that you're sharing this with some people that understand the craft as well, or is it just you're totally relaxed about it?
It's an interesting question. Obviously, I've become friends with a lot of these people over the course of my time working in Hollywood. And so on that level, I'm excited to share the movie with them. I'm sure there are going to be things that people will take issue with, but this is the thrill of getting to work on a Quentin Tarantino movie. Like, you don't have to play by the rules. There's nobody with a greater knowledge of what's come before him in this medium, and there's nobody who's more willing to just do his own thing and try something different. And, is that going to work for everyone? No, probably not. But that's okay. I'm thrilled to get to be a part of Quentin's creative process. And yeah, it's just a joy.
Wow. Man, do you geek out about stuff like this like I do? I love talking to these folks. That was so much fun. I can't thank Fred enough for doing that. He was so great to share so much with us. If you haven't seen the film yet, hopefully this got you excited to see it. We tried to give you as much detail today without offering up any spoilers. I think we did okay on that front. All I can say is that the film is everything you'd expect from a Quentin Tarantino film, and that there are things you'd never expect. Fred and Quentin are master manipulators when it comes to making an audience, as I said before, comfortably uneasy while they're enjoying the story as it unfolds. And then they give you things you never expected, while taking away things that too many films just hand over to you. Unwrap that riddle, why don't you? I'll give you another week to think about it before I unleash another episode of the podcast. Before I go, if you plan to be in LA around August 24th, that's a Saturday, the Ace Edit Fest will be happening at Disney Studios in Burbank. It's going to be a fun day of informative panels featuring very cool people who edit many of the films and TV shows you love, probably some of the ones you don't. Either way, you'll learn a ton and have a good time, and I'll be there hosting a panel, but come anyway. In addition to that, I want to give you the usual reminder about Media Composer First. What's that, you say? Well, it's the free version of Media Composer. Yes, it's free. So if you already use Media Composer and you have a friend that doesn't, well, why are you friends with them? No, I don't mean that. But here's a way you can introduce them to Avid, and it doesn't cost anything. So check it out. And until next time, this is Matt Fury thanking you for listening. Come back and see us again soon on The Rough Cut.